Hello, my name is David Ruchnick, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this course on Plato's Republic. In this first lecture, I'd like to accomplish two things. First, I'd like to give you an overview of the entire course, and second, I'd like to give you a very brief look at Plato's life and times in order to give you some historical background that might enhance your appreciation of the Republic. Let me begin by first telling you a little bit about the book we're about to study together. Plato's Republic was written in approximately 380 BCE, before the Common Era. All the dates, by the way, that I cite from here on will be BCE, so I won't repeat that. Without a doubt, Plato's Republic was the first great work in the Western tradition that concerned itself with political philosophy. It's arguable that it was also the most influential in the whole subsequent history of Western political philosophy. Furthermore, it's even arguable that the Republic was the most influential book in the history of philosophy in general. As we'll see, the original and overriding concern in this book is political, but it will also move far beyond the political into questions that are of purely philosophical interest. Let me give you a little sense of why I made the claim that I did, that this is the first great work in the history of political philosophy, by simply listing for you a series of questions that Plato will address in the Republic. First and foremost, what is justice? What is the best life a human being can lead? What is education? What is the role education should play in a political system? Is censorship of music and literature ever justified? What sort of person should rule the state? Is it ever permissible for a ruler to lie to the citizens? Should citizens be allowed complete freedom when it comes to private property and sexual relationships? Are all citizens equal before the law? Should women have equal rights as men? Should all citizens have equal access to health care? This is nothing more than a small sample of the kinds of questions we're going to be discussing. I hope it gives you a little taste of what's in store. Let me turn next to the question of how we're actually going to proceed in this course. We'll operate with a very simple pedagogical strategy. We're going to read this book as carefully as we can. We're going to begin at the beginning. In fact, we will begin with the title of the dialogue, and we will work our way to the end. I consider it to be my job to try to bring this book to life. What I will suggest to you over and over again as we discuss various issues in the Republic is that these questions, even though they were initially formulated over 2,000 years ago, are alive and well today. Again and again, we'll see that Plato sounds like a contemporary. He doesn't seem, when you think about him, to be like a museum piece or a relic. He seems to be sitting next door to us and speaking directly to us and to our own concerns. Let me turn next to the structure of the dialogue. The Republic is very clearly structured. It has 10 books, we might call them chapters, and they can be organized into 4 separate parts. Book 1 is a prologue. It introduces the cast of characters. It suggests the most basic issue that we will pursue for the entire course, namely, what is justice? And the follow-up question to that is, why is a life of justice superior to a life of injustice? We then move to books 2, 3, and 4, the next stage of the Republic. And what we will find here is what I will call a construction project. The characters will construct a hypothetical or an ideal city, a city in speech, a city they will claim is, in fact, just. The next section is constituted by books 5, 6, and 7. And here we'll find a great digression. And we will find Plato telling us an enormous amount, not simply about politics and political philosophy, but philosophy in general. These central books of the Republic are sometimes referred to as just that, the philosophical books of the dialogue. And they are what justify the earlier claim I made that it is arguable that Plato's Republic is not only the most influential book in the history of political philosophy, but in philosophy in general. The last stage of the Republic is constituted by books 8, 9, and 10. And here we'll find the characters returning to the theme of real-world politics. Socrates, the hero of the dialogue, whom I'll discuss in just a few minutes, will discuss regimes that are unjust and very familiar to us today. To reiterate our pedagogical goal, we will work our way as carefully as time allows through each of these 4 sections of the dialogue. In the very last lecture of the course, I'll shift focus, and I will concentrate on the amazing level of influence that the Republic has had in the subsequent history of political philosophy. Let me say a few more words about the mechanics of this course. There are many good English translations of Plato's Republic. The one that I use and that I will occasionally cite from is by Alan Bloom. The book is listed in your bibliography. There's no need for you to use that translation only. I've listed several other translations in the bibliography as well. Even if you don't use the Bloom translation, which I'm using, you'll still be able to follow exactly where I am in the text. And this is because scholars have developed a standard paging system. The numbers of the text, which in most books will be in the margins and are called Stephanus page numbers, are the common page numbers that you'll find in any translation. So, for example, you will see the number 521A. That refers to page 521, that is Stephanus page. A refers to a paragraph or a series of lines. I will only refer to Stephanus page numbers in both my lectures and in the written material that accompanies this course. Let me turn next to a brief look at Plato's life and times. He was born in Athens in 429 to a very distinguished, powerful, and wealthy family. What this means, of course, is that he came of age in the 5th century in Athens. Now, I put some emphasis on that point because the 5th century in Athens is one of the most extraordinary centuries in the history of Western culture. It was an explosive century, and the events of that century, without a doubt, influenced Plato greatly. I'd like to give you a very brief chronological tour of the 5th century by listing a few dates and telling you some of the pivotal events that occurred at those times. Let's actually begin a bit earlier in the 6th century, 507. This is the date on which the Pisistratide tyranny that had ruled Athens was overthrown and a democracy replaced it. For the next 100 years, Athens was a democracy and was proud of being a democracy. Indeed, being a democracy went to the very heart and soul of Athenian self-identity. As you will see as our course unfolds, the issue of democracy, a fundamental political issue, is never far from Plato's mind in writing the Republic. And we will discuss it from the beginning to the end. 480. This is the time when the Greeks defeated the Persians in the Persian War. Without going into any detail, the Persians had amassed an enormous empire to the east of Greece. They were an oppressive, tyrannical regime. They were expansionist, and they looked at Greece and wanted to conquer it. The odds of the Persians defeating the Greeks were huge because, again, the Persians had amassed an enormous army. Nonetheless, under Athenian leadership, the Greeks did defeat the Persians, particularly at the battles of Salamis and Plataea. Now notice, I've talked about the Greeks. Please realize that in antiquity, there was no country, Greece. That's a very, very late development. What there was a series of very small, independent city-states. Each of them was a self-sufficient political community on its own. Athens was one of those city-states. Sparta, Thebes, Corinth were others. It was under Athenian leadership that the Greeks pulled off this remarkable upset and defeated the Persians. I mention this because this is the beginning of Athenian greatness in the 5th century. Next date is 469. This is the time during which Pericles, the greatest of all Athenian political leaders, ascended to power. The subsequent decades have come to be known as the Periclean Age. And during this time, Athens became a great military, economic, political, and cultural power. We call it the Periclean Age, even though Athens, as I've suggested, was a democracy and proud of being a democracy. Still, there was no doubt that Pericles was first among equals. This was a time of explosion. Athens was expanding, again, not only in a military and political sense, but also, and perhaps more significantly, in a cultural sense. This is the time of the building of the Parthenon. It's the time of the great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. It's the time of comic poetry. The great Aristophanes essentially invented the genre of comedy. Herodotus invented history. Thucydides, at the end of the century, some would say, perfected the genre of history. There were extraordinary developments in mathematics and in the natural sciences. It was, in short, a wonderful time. 431 is the beginning of the end, the beginning of the bad times in the 5th century. It was the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. Unlike the Persian War, when the Greek city-states were unified and were fighting against the Persians, during the Peloponnesian War, it was Greek against Greek. Most significantly, it was Athens against Sparta. 404, 27 years later, Athens lost. The length of time suggests how awful a war it was. It was a war that was prolonged at the cost of terrible bloodshed and destruction. And indeed, by 404, Athens which had reached such levels of greatness only a few decades earlier, was brought to ruin. The worst aspect of this downfall for the Athenians was the destruction of their cherished system of democratic rule. Democracy itself was overthrown in Athens in the year 404. It was replaced by a group of tyrants who came to be known as the Tyranny of the 30. This was a traumatic event, to say the least. Fortunately, democracy was restored very quickly in the year 403. Nonetheless, the magnitude of this defeat of democracy was almost incalculable. And without a doubt, it made a gigantic impression on Plato. He was, in the year 404, 25 years old. He witnessed the destruction of his own city. As we read the Republic, I will refer over and over again to this fact, the tyranny of the 30. It's not far from Plato's mind ever in the writing of the Republic. 399. Socrates was executed. I mentioned his name a few minutes ago. I don't yet want to tell you very much about Socrates because we're going to go into great detail about him throughout this course. Suffice it to say here that he was a philosopher and that he was Plato's philosophical inspiration. I'm tempted to say he was Plato's teacher, but in fact I believe that would be inaccurate. I don't think Socrates actually taught anyone. He did, however, surely inspire Plato. The fact that he was executed in 399 and he was executed by the democracy, again, made a huge impression on Plato, certainly set his philosophical gears into motion and led to the writing of the Republic. To sum up, Plato came of age in an extraordinary, tumultuous, heart-rending time. All of his subsequent philosophical work, I would argue, is informed by that period of time. What I have in mind in particular is that Plato is not simply an abstract thinker. He doesn't just cook up theories for their own sake, although he's awfully good at cooking up theories. Everything that Plato does philosophically is motivated by a concern for the real living of life in a city. He had witnessed things go bad in his own city of Athens. He had witnessed his philosophical inspiration, Socrates, be executed. When he writes philosophy, when he composes the Republic, he's thinking about issues like that. At various junctures in this course, we are going to talk about very difficult, abstract and conceptual issues. Try not to lose sight of this basic fact about Plato, that he was, from the beginning of his career to the end, concerned with the life of the city. Let me give you a couple of more dates which I think substantiate this point. 388. Plato took the first of his 3 trips to Sicily. Of course, Sicily is now part of Italy. In those days, it was actually Greek. Plato was visiting Sicily in order to work with a ruler who lived there whose name was Dionysus. What clearly Plato hoped for in interacting with Dionysus, in undertaking what was in fact a very difficult journey to go from Athens to Sicily, is very easy today. In ancient times, it required a great deal of effort. Plato made that effort because he had great hopes for Dionysus. What seems to be the case is that Plato hoped that in Sicily, with this ruler, he could put some of his ideas about politics into practice. Again, I mention this in order to suggest to you that Plato is not an otherworldly, abstract philosopher interested only in beautiful concepts or beautiful theories. He's concerned with real human beings. His trip to Sicily, I believe, is evidence for that. He failed. He failed with Dionysus. He failed with Dionysus' son, Dionysus II. Perhaps as a result of this failure, Plato returned to Athens in 386, and he founded his own school. It was called the Academy, a word still used today. Our word academic derives from the name of Plato's school. It's very likely that Plato funded this school with his own money. He came from a very wealthy family. We don't know, unfortunately, much about what went on in the Academy, but we do know that it was devoted to the study of philosophy. And one thing that surely went on in the Academy was the study of political philosophy, the study of justice. Once again, I'm trying to make the point that while Plato removed himself somewhat in 386 from the rough and tumble world of politics, he nonetheless continued the effort, even when he was only working in the academy, to make some connection, make some improvement to the real world of politics. I suggested that not only was Athens a great political and military power, it was also a great cultural power in the 5th century. I'd like to turn next to a brief look at some of the intellectual forces that no doubt helped to shape Plato's thought. I can begin very early and mention Homer and Hesiod, neither of whom was Athenian, both of whom, of course, were Greek. They lived and wrote somewhere between 750 and 700, and we will find a discussion of Homer and Hesiod in the Republic. So clearly this is an influence on Plato's own thinking. In Athens itself, as I've mentioned, we find Aeschylus, who lived from 525 to 456, Sophocles, 496 to 406, and Euripides, 485 to 406. We find the great comic poet Aristophanes, from 450 to 385. Aristophanes even wrote a play that made fun of the philosopher Socrates. There were many philosophers in Athens. There were many philosophers in other Greek city-states before Plato. Sometimes these are called the pre-Socratic philosophers. Socrates lived from 469 to 399. The pre-Socratic philosophers are those philosophers who lived before or during the life of Socrates. Let me just give you some names and some dates. I would urge you to look up some of these figures. They're very interesting in their own right, and there's no doubt that they, once again, had a great influence on Plato's development. Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes were among the first philosophers. They lived in a town called Miletus, and they did their work in the 6th century. Heraclitus lived approximately 540 to 480. Parmenides lived from approximately 515 to 440. He, by the way, is particularly important. In fact, in one dialogue, a character written by Plato says, Parmenides was my father, meaning my intellectual father. He had a great influence on Plato. Pythagoras, the great mathematical philosopher who, legend has it, discovered the Pythagorean theorem, lived from approximately 570 to 495. Anaxagoras, 500 to 428. Empedocles, 493 to 433. Democritus, 465 to 400, were among the most influential thinkers of the 5th century. Another tremendously influential group A group with whom Plato was well acquainted were known as the Sophists. These were itinerant teachers. They moved from city-state to city-state, and they mainly taught rhetoric. I won't go into any detail now about the Sophists, but we will talk about sophistry in some detail soon because, in fact, in Book 1 of the Republic, we will meet a sophist. His name is Thrasymachus, and we will talk about him at some length. For now, let me just give you some names and dates. Protagoras was often counted as the first great sophist, lived from approximately 485 to 400. Gorgias, 483 to 376. Isocrates, 436 to 338, lived during Plato's lifetime and was his great rival. That notion of a rivalry between the philosopher Plato and a sophist like Isocrates is pivotal. Once again, we'll take it up shortly when we turn to Book 1 of the Republic. Finally, there was Socrates, a name I've mentioned a couple of times. He lived 469 to 399, and he was far and away the greatest single influence on Plato. We don't know very much about this historical figure. He wrote nothing. We can make some guesses about who he was based on the writings of Plato, because Plato made Socrates the hero of many of his dialogues, including the Republic. There were other writers as well who discussed Socrates, but Plato, again, is our principal source. I want to make just a couple of points about Socrates because we will discuss him consistently throughout our discussion of the entire Republic. Unlike other pre-Socratic philosophers, Socrates concentrated on political and ethical questions. He was famous for asking a certain kind of question. It's known as the "what is it" question. He asked questions like, what is justice? What is courage? What is beauty? What is goodness? These are all humanly charged questions. After he would ask somebody a question and they would offer an answer, Socrates was very famous for then refuting their answer. This is known as the elenchus, the refutation. As a result of this, Socrates was a very annoying person. We'll see him at his annoyingly best throughout the Republic. He was described once as a gadfly, that fly that stings and irritates, but nonetheless wakes up an otherwise slumbering horse. We don't know exactly why Socrates was executed in 399. This is an issue we will talk about later, but we can guess. One reason, perhaps, is precisely the one I mentioned. He was so annoying. Let me close with a couple of important points, important warnings. It's impossible to tell whether the Socrates we will meet in the Republic bears any resemblance to the historical figure who lived between 469 and 399. After all, that person didn't write anything. So I want to be clear about one thing. Anytime I use the word Socrates, I am referring to the character who appears in Plato's dialogue. I am not making a claim about the historical figure about whom we really know next to nothing except that he inspired Plato. A second point. The Republic, as you will see very shortly, is a complex and difficult work. As a result, it requires a commentator like myself to often engage in some interpretation. What I will try to be scrupulous about is telling you when I am offering you my own interpretation of a little bit of the text, and in the bibliography, I will offer you some alternative interpretations so that you can challenge my reading. I hope you enjoy your reading of the Republic, and I look forward to beginning.